Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. The relationship between the world's two largest economies, well, it feels incredibly volatile right now, doesn't it?
It really does. Constant tension.
Yeah, we're looking at potential leader-level meetings, maybe in South Korea, but at the same time, there are these threats flying around. Massive tariffs, over 100% mention.
And these new, really complex regulatory systems being built up on both sides.
Exactly. And all this turbulence has led to this pretty pointed question we want to explore. Is China actually winning the trade war? Is it achieving what some call escalatory dominance?
That idea that they're somehow coming out on top in this economic conflict that, let's face it, Washington really initiated.
Right. So our mission today is to kind of step back from those big headlines, winning, losing, and really pressure test the procedural facts underneath.
Yeah, we need to look at the how, not just the what.
Is the evidence pointing towards a clear win for Beijing? Or are we just seeing something else, like a new, maybe painful reality of managed rivalry, mutual adaptation under serious pressure?
I think that procedural focus is absolutely crucial because the whole winning narrative, it suggests this neat scoreboard. And the data, frankly, it resists that simplicity. But we do have to understand why people are talking about winning.
Okay.
And it really rests on this core assertion that China is just more resilient, that it's better able to absorb economic pain than the U.S. is able to handle the market fallout from its own policies.
Okay, let's start right there then. This argument suggests that the view in some parts of Washington Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was mentioned as maybe holding this view that China is economically weak, that this view is just, wrong.
Fundamentally flawed is the argument.
So what's the strongest evidence people point to for China's resilience?
Well, the first big reason cited is market confidence. Or maybe U.S. lack of confidence in its own actions. Remember those Liberation Day tariffs back in April? The White House imposed them and then pretty quickly reversed or modified them after Wall Street took a nosedive.
Right. I remember that volatility.
Analysts look at that and say, see, China weathered the storm and the U.S. blinked when markets got shaky.
And it's not just about dodging tariff bullets, is it? There's the stock market performance, too.
Exactly. The MSCI China Index, looking at it in U.S. dollar terms, has had a remarkable run this year.
What were the figures again? Up over 40%?
Yeah, something like 41.6% year-to-date by the end of September. That blew past global benchmarks like the S&P 500.
Wow.
And that kind of number, it's used as this powerful symbol, right, to suggest that investors still have durable confidence in China's economic future despite all the U.S. pressure and trade friction.
Okay, so resilience is point one. Beyond that, the sources talk about strategic retaliation. China isn't just playing defense.
No, definitely not. They're hitting back, but surgically.
Surgically? How so?
Well, we recently saw those reciprocal port charges on shipping. They took something mundane, logistics, and turned it into a targeted economic pain point. And this surgical idea, it extends to regulation, too. Beijing has, opened or at least hinted at antitrust probes against major U.S. tech firms.
We saw names like NVIDIA,
Qualcomm, DuPont, Google, yeah. They're clearly leveraging access to their huge domestic market. That's a massive bargaining chip in these global fights.
But maybe the most politically potent move, especially thinking about any upcoming talks.
Has to be the agriculture trade, right?
Exactly. China's imports of U.S. soybeans just dropped to 0 in September. For the first time since, 2018?
Yeah, 0. That's not subtle. It's a highly tactical shot aimed squarely at politically sensitive regions in the U.S., the Midwest farm states.
It feels very calibrated, like pressure applied just ahead of potential meetings.
It is wholly calibrated, absolutely. But the real strategic core of this winning argument, I think, is the third point, this idea that China is actually rewriting global trade norms.
Right. Because even though their shipments to the U.S. fell sharply, about 27% down year on year by September,
their total exports still went up, around 8% year over year.
Which means they're successfully diversifying, sending goods elsewhere.
Exactly. Rerouting trade, finding new markets or expanding existing ones in places like the EU, ASEAN, Africa. It shows crucial adaptability.
Okay.
But perhaps the biggest move, the biggest procedural counterweapon, is this new licensing regime they're setting up.
The one for rare earths, magnets, battery materials. Effective late 2025.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Because it's a direct response, and it basically mirrors the complex regulatory tools the U.S. itself has been using for years, especially export controls.
Okay, I have to admit, that does build a pretty compelling case for Beijing's resilience and tactical smarts. But calling it a win, that still feels like a stretch somehow.
I agree. It feels like an overreach.
So if we look closer, where does this narrative of Chinese dominance start to break down?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because the evidence, when you really dig in, it seems to fit better with a framework of, say, managed rivalry, or maybe procedural one-upmanship, rather than a clear victory.
Managed rivalry. Okay,
Yeah.
how so?
We'll take that idea of U.S. policy inconsistency. The narrative that the White House always chickens out when markets wobble. The taco idea, as some call it.
Right, Trump always chickens out.
It kind of oversimplifies what actually happened back in April. Yes, the administration did soften some of those broad reciprocal tariffs after the market shock, but almost simultaneously, just days later, they raised other rates that were specifically targeted at China. China remained singled out.
Okay. So it wasn't a full retreat purely because of market fear or Chinese resilience. It was more like a policy shift.
Exactly. A shift away from blunt reciprocal tariffs that hit everyone towards more targeted China-specific pressure. It was a refinement of tactics, not necessarily a surrender.
And what about comparing the tools? You mentioned China's new licensing regime versus U.S. tariffs or controls. Is it an even match?
Well, that's the thing. It's not really a clean scoreboard.
Right.
Washington's existing export controls, especially the really advanced ones on semiconductors, chip-making equipment, design software.
The stuff China can't easily replace domestically.
Precisely. Those still hit critical choke points. China can't just replicate that overnight. So, arguably, the U.S. still holds significant high-tech leverage.
Okay, so if the U.S. still controls some fundamental tech levers, what does that say about that huge 41% Chinese stock market rally? Is that really durable proof of victory?
That's a really important question to ask. I mean, that rally likely reflects a mix of things, doesn't it?
Like what?
Well, partly a valuation reset after a pretty steep prior decline, partly specific pro-market policies from Beijing itself, and partly just global enthusiasm for things like AI, where Chinese companies are also players.
So confidence plus policy support maybe, not purely a verdict on the trade war.
I think that's a better way to put it. Confidence plus policy, not necessarily durable proof of some geopolitical victory mandate. And notice how that market volatility keeps snapping back every time trade tensions flare up again.
Yeah, that's true.
That tells you the underlying uncertainty. It hasn't really gone away.
And the regulatory moves from China, those antitrust probes you mentioned, are they all-out escalation or more like bargaining chips?
They really appear to be highly calibrated bargaining tools. I mean, look at how flexibly they seem to handle them.
How so?
Well, they might open a probe related to a Qualcomm deal, putting pressure there. But then at other times, we've seen reports of them suspending or even dropping separate probes into firms like Google or DuPont.
Interesting.
That suggests they're using enforcement selectively, tactically, to achieve specific goals, yes, but also, crucially, to preserve room for high-level talks. It's not just about burning bridges.
Okay, this is leading us towards maybe the biggest strategic shift here, this move away from blunt tariffs towards these much more sophisticated, almost mirrored regulatory controls.
Yes.
We need to spend a bit more time on China's new licensing regime for rare earths and battery stuff, especially that extraterritorial hook detail. Why is that potentially such a big deal?
Right, because this is China really professionalizing its control system, essentially borrowing directly from Washington's playbook. The rules are set for November 8th, 2025.
Okay.
And they include this potentially massive jurisdictional reach. That extraterritorial hook basically means that foreign goods made anywhere in the world, not just in China, if they contain even trace amounts of Chinese content from these specific sensitive supply chains, well, those products might suddenly need a China export license to be sold or moved.
Wait, trace content, even if the final product is assembled entirely outside China, say in Europe or Mexico?
That's the potential implication. It's a deliberate echo of how the U.S. Export Administration regulations, the ER, work.
How do they work?
The U.S. ER can dictate that even a non-U.S. made component, if it incorporates a certain amount of U.S. technology or software above a threshold, has to comply with U.S. export controls. China seems to be setting up the exact same logic, but weaponizing its unique position as a supplier of critical raw materials and processed inputs.
So like if a tiny bit of processed Chinese magnet wire ends up in a component made for a German car.
Beijing could, under these rules, theoretically claim it needs to license the export of that German car component worldwide.
Wow. That sounds like a massive potential headache for global supply chains, far beyond simple tariffs.
It absolutely is. And what it signals is this norm evolving towards mutual licensing. Both sides are building these complex regulatory walls, claiming veto power over crucial supply chains using these sophisticated legal mechanisms.
Structured interdependence, you called it.
Exactly. Structured interdependence. Neither side is trying to completely collapse global trade that would hurt everyone too much.
Right.
But the new normal, the steady state, looks like it involves a lot more compliance, more paperwork, more fees, more licenses, basically a higher cost and complexity for doing global business.
Okay, so if China isn't necessarily winning in a simple sense, the evidence strongly suggests they're incredibly adaptable. And maybe the big takeaway is this resilience that's powered primarily by rechanneling exports.
I think that's right. That 8% total export growth, despite the U.S. shipments dropping, that seems to be almost entirely down to trade diversion.
Sending goods to the EU, Asia, and Africa instead.
Exactly. It cushions the blow from the U.S. market loss.
Oh.
But it's worth noting that probably introduces new frictions with those partners, too, who are now dealing with this influx of goods.
Good point. And those targeted pressure points, like the zero soybean buys, they remain crucial bargaining chips, timed for political impact.
Yes, designed specifically to create leverage, particularly ahead of dialogue or negotiation. They're levers for talks, not necessarily tools for causing a complete economic breakdown.
Okay. So if you're listening to this and trying to figure out where this intense rivalry is actually heading beyond the daily headlines, what are the key signals we should all be watching over the next year or so?
I'd say focus on the implementation details, not just the announcements.
Okay, signal number one.
How China actually implements that licensing regime after November 2025. We need to watch the practicalities. What are the approval rates going to look like? How long will processing take?
And how clear will they be on that really tricky trace content rule?
Exactly. If licenses flow relatively quickly and predictably, okay, the disruption might be contained. But if the process is opaque, slow, arbitrary, then global supply chains could face years of really crippling uncertainty.
Okay, that's crucial. And key signal number two.
Watch the actual outcomes of any leader-level meetings or even lower-level talks, like the Sherpa talks in Malaysia we heard about. Don't look for some grand bargain to end all conflict.
No big deal.
Probably not. Look instead for a procedural package.
Procedural package. What does that even look like? Sounds boring.
It is boring, and that's why it's important. It's about technical agreements. Things like, say, mutually agreed notice periods before introducing new controls, or maybe commitments to issue parallel factual readouts after major policy moves instead of just competing propaganda.
Okay. Things that reduce uncertainty and miscalculation?
Precisely. Those kinds of mundane, process-oriented agreements could actually calm global supply chains much more effectively than any temporary tariff truce or grand political statement.
So, putting this all together, what's the bigger picture here? The analysis seems to suggest China isn't just winning or losing in some simple contest.
No, it seems to be strategically adapting. It's shaping procedures, mirroring the American regulatory playbook to build its own leverage.
Which leads to maybe a more provocative thought for people to consider. If the long-term result of all this conflict isn't a clear winner, but instead a world defined by this mutual licensing, these extraterritorial hooks, targeted barriers, basically two great powers behind complex regulatory walls.
A retreat from the old model of open commerce.
Does that ultimately make everyone worse off, including the U.S. and China themselves? That really seems to be the heavy implication of these deep procedural shifts we're seeing.
It's a sobering possibility.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.